Reconstruction is the attempted reform movement from 1865 to 1876 where the South tried to rebuild most of the broken Southern society after the Civil War. The Reconstruction period was unsuccessful as most of the South did not experience dramatic changes. Hayes tried to eliminate political corruption as he tried to advocate a nonpartisan reformed civil service, observing that he serves his party, but who serves his country.
Hayes ran against Tilden in the election, and even though he won, people thought he won unfairly. Tilden, however, actually got more votes than Hayes, but Hayes got the majority of the...
Even though other presidents served in the Civil War, Hayes was the only one to have been wounded. He was known as a decent man, but he came to power under dubious circumstances.
His attempts at civil service reforms are generally respected, but his removal of troops from the South is largely blamed for the Jim Crow segregation. During Garfield's presidency, stalwarts were Republicans who favored the spoils system. It was the cause of Republican Party split, led by the New York Senator Roscoe Coughlin. They opposed the civil service reform policy of Hayes.
Mugwumps were Democrats who supported Grover Cleveland. After the election, the term turned into someone who is independent or remains independent or are neutral.
Half-breeds are a Republican Party headed by James G. Blaine. They pushed Republican ideals and were almost a separate group that existed within the party. Another party was the Populist Party. The Populist Party focused on railroads, silver coinage, crop prices, and inflation, and were supported by William Jennings Bryan in the 1896 election. They're most famous for their Omaha platform, which called for the end of national banks, direct election of senators, government control of all utilities, an 8-hour workday, and to establish an income tax. The assassination of President Garfield happened on July 2nd of 1881. After 4 months of his presidency, Garfield was shot by Charles Guiteau when he was about to board a train in Washington, D.C. Charles Guiteau assassinated him because he thought Garfield owed him a political position and that Garfield's decisions threatened the Republican Party. The Pendleton Act prohibited financial assessments on job holders and got rid of the spoils system. It also set up a civil service commission, which made it a law to take an exam before being hired to a governmental job position. James G. Blaine was a backer of Rutherford B. Hayes and was a leader of the half-breed faction of the party. He opposed the Conclusion stalwarts. Blaine failed to win the Republican nomination in 1876 and again in 1880. He was politically hurt by apparent involvement in a railroad scandal.
He was rewarded for his support of James A. Garfield in 1880 by being the Secretary of State. He resigned shortly after Garfield's assassination.
Mugwumps were Republicans who supported the Democratic presidential candidate Grover Cleveland in the election of 1884. Because they viewed their own party's candidate, James G. Blaine, as corrupt, many historians believe that Mugwumps swung the election to Cleveland by helping him win in New York. The Wilson-Gorman Tariff, formed in 1894, was an act setting the tariff at 41.3%. It was not as low as the Democrats wanted it to be. Cleveland was outraged that it did not go by campaign pledges. He had to sign it to have a lower tariff, but he was annoyed with its ineffectiveness. It was also the first bill to introduce an income tax, but that was later struck down as unconstitutional.
Billion-Dollar Congress. The Billion-Dollar Congress of 1890 passed record number of significant laws that helped shape later policies and asserted authority of federal government. It gave pensions to Civil War veterans, it increased government silver purchases, and passed the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890.
The Granger movement began in the late 1860s by farmers who called for government regulation of railroads and other industries whose prices and practices they claimed were monopolistic and unfair.
Their efforts contribute to a growing public sentiment against monopolism.
The Granger movement and Munn v. Illinois case helped to make public regulation for private businesses that were devoted to public use.
Block voting is used by the Grange to allow Granger members to get into state legislation. Once on the inside, the Grange members would support railroad reforms.
The Granger state laws are code by which railroads have to abide to. Their aim was to make railroad practices more fair for farmers.
Munn v. Illinois. The Munn v. Illinois case is the upheld right of states to regulate private property when it is in the interest of the public. The firm of Ira Munn and George Scott's successors used illegal rates for their warehouses. Then they appealed to the Supreme Court when Illinois' Supreme Court upheld the law. Interstate commerce. The result of the case was denial of state power to regulate interstate rates for railroad. It was the decision that led to the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission.
The complaint from Ira Munn and George Scott is that the Warehouse Act was a violation of the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the state.
The Wabash case was between the St. Louis and Pacific Railroad in Illinois. The court declared invalid as Illinois law prohibiting long and short haul clauses in transportation contracts as an infringement on the exclusive powers of Congress.
The result of the case was denial of state power to regulate interstate rates for railroad. It was the decision that led to the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission.
The Interstate Commerce Act created the Interstate Commerce Commission, the first true federal regulatory agency. It was designed to address the issues of railroad abuse and discrimination.
Shipping rates to be reasonable and just. The rates also had to be published. The secret rebates were outlawed and price discrimination against small markets were made illegal.
The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was the first legislation enacted by the United States Congress to curb concentrations of power that interfere with trade and reduce economic competition. It was named for U.S. Senator John Sherman.
The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was the first federal antitrust law. It prohibited any contract, conspiracy, or combination of business interests in the restraining of foreign or interstate trade.
One of the main provisions outlaws all combination that restrain trade between states or with foreign nations. Election of 1896. In the election of 1896, the Cross of Gold was a speech given by William Jennings Bryan on July 9, 1896, at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The main point of the convention was whether to endorse the silver coin. The inflation would have increased the amount of money in circulation and would have helped poor and debt-burdened farmers.
Bread and butter unionism is an idea of basic unionism. It advocated the basics of union laborers wanting better wages and better working conditions.
The collective bargaining system is a compromise between employers and a labor union traditionally of hours, wages, and working conditions.
The Knights of Labor, formed in 1896, was the first effort to create a national union. Unfortunately, it was under weak leadership and unorganized. The union was open to anyone except for lawyers and bankers.
It later failed because people thought that they had a part in the Haymarket Square bombing.
The Haymarket Square bombing happened on May 4, 1886. Chicago police were coming up to a meeting that was called in order to address protest brutality by authorities. During the police advance, a dynamite bomb was set off which killed and injured several dozen people. This took place in Chicago, where tension had been building over anarchists who advocated for a violent overthrow of American government.
American Federation of Law. The American Federation of Labor, formed in 1886, was headed by Samuel Gompers. It was a federation of North American labor unions. Their goals were for better working wages, conditions, and strikes.
The International Ladies Garment Workers Union consisted primarily of females. They were one of the largest labor unions in the U.S. They fought for safer working conditions for sweatshop workers in the garment industry.
Homestead Strike. The Homestead Strike of 1892 was a protest of repeated wage cuts in Pittsburgh. The strike turned extremely violent and hurt the public view of labor unions.
The Pullman Strike was a non-violent strike led by Eugene Debs. It shut down Western railroads and was caused by the cut of Pullman workers. The strike happened in Chicago in 1894 against the Palace Car Company. The strike was later ended by the president.
The Gilded Age was a time of forgettable presidents, big businesses, poor working condition, monopolies, and the violent strikes of labor unions.